The strings on a musical instrument are something so specific and technical that it's really only those people playing and interacting with them daily who tend to give the topic a second thought. Yet our thinking, expressed in the metaphors and symbols we use, is deeply intertwined with the concept of strings, and we reference them every single day. When somebody is nervous, we call them highly strung. In Germany, a sensitive person is zart beseitet, thinly strung, and if they want to turn things around and make a change, they put on a different set of strings, andere Saiten aufziehen. When the French agree, they say that they are d'accord. L'accord also being the word for chord, and la corde for string. But immediately the German will say, das stimmt nicht. This is out of tune, as in not correct, as the word accord doesn't actually stem from la corde, but the Latin cor, heart, as in cordial. The French will respond that they never thought of this before, as their word for heart is not cor, but cœur. The Old Greek is in tune with this confusion and reminds us that the Latin cor is derived from the Greek cardia, while the word for string is corde.
Leo played you like a violin.
Meanwhile, the Anglophone, somewhat strung out by this conversation, remembers something that really tugged at their heartstrings recently. It was Richard III by the famous William Shakespeare.
Harp not on that string, madam, that is past.
Harp on it still till I do heartstrings break.
Now,
Even someone who touched not one string in his life still constantly references them without noticing. And some of those metaphors go way back to a time when depictions of musical instruments were not always just simple references to music and music making, but visual metaphors in their own right. This still life is one of the countless vanitas paintings created in the 1600s. It even says so right there on the label. And among symbols like the burnt out lamp, the dropped chalice, the hourglass, the clock, the torn calendar, and the skull, there's also a broken string on the violin. A key to understanding this metaphor can be found in the book Wit's Recreation, published some years earlier, where the poem Upon Lute Strings, Cat-Eaten, begins by asking, could these neglected shreds you see inspire a lute of ivory and make it speak? So, if the strings inspire, that is, lend spirit to a body, in this case the body of a violin, an instrument without strings must consequently be without a doubt the most famous string in art history was broken by someone else though, Hans Holbein, for his painting called The Ambassadors. Here, the string that has snapped in two points to discord, an imperfection in that otherwise harmonious and ordered structure, not only in regards to the instrument itself, but also the life of its player and the world as a whole. Now, if we just look a little further downward, we once more encounter...
Ah! What is it? Is that a good ah?
It is death.
Well, in the tarot, death just means change, right? I mean, it's nothing to get worried about, right?
Sure, whatever you say. Now please go.
To really understand the symbolism here, it's important to know that the strings used back then were extremely fragile. The thinnest and clearest string, called treble in England, chanterelle in France, and canto in Italy, had a life expectancy of only a few days at best before it would eventually snap. Having this happen in the middle of a performance must have been pretty common, so to avoid embarrassing yourself and continue playing, you either had to pull one of these, or you had to have a trick up your sleeve, like the Venetian lutenist Marco dell'Aquila, who wrote the piece Senza Canto, without the top string. Now, finding a fresh string for Marco dell'Aquila's lute would have been less convenient than perhaps expected. Before the Industrial Revolution, when everything still had to be made by hand, production was for the most part local, so there was also no need for standardized products. An artist wouldn't just buy a ready-made box of paint, but instead had to make their own colors from different pigments and binding agents. This was time-consuming, expensive, and took years to learn, yet also constituted part of their mastery. Not seldom, a great painter's work can immediately be recognized by its coloration, the materials that were used, and how they were handled. Similarly, an experienced musician's choice of strings, setup, and tuning would distinguish them with the first chord they played. This perhaps explains why all early instructions on musical instruments begin with extensive sections on strings, how to tune them, how to test them for tiny imperfections and fix them, and what kinds to go for. Most strings were made from a material called catgut, but even though the poem Upon Lute Strings, Cat Eaten accuses the cat in question of cannibalism, these strings were not made from cats. Let me just repeat this. Cats are not killed in order to make strings, okay? Instead, these strings are the result of a complex process involving the intestines of a less controversial choice of animal, the sheep. Well, actually, the highest quality strings are made from lamb.
Out of the way, you!
As one would expect, the characteristics of these strings depended very much on where they were being made. There was no standard. If you entered a music shop and asked for a set of strings, the salesman would first ask you where from, of what type, what size, and of what kind of gut you'd like them. Or would you perhaps prefer strings made from brass? Despite this incredible diversity, there persisted one standard after all. If an instrument had a neck and wasn't played with a bow, the strings were always double. So when playing a note, you would actually pluck two strings together. With very few exceptions, the entirety of Europe held on to this for hundreds of years, despite the many drawbacks. Contrary to expectation, the paired strings don't actually make the instrument louder, but require a playing technique that produces less volume. Of course, you'd also have to buy twice as many of the already expensive strings, so it's questionable whether the famous German musician and theorist Johann Mattheson really was joking when he wrote that the maintenance for a lute cost about as much as for a horse, or that if a lute player actually made it to the age of 80, they must have spent 60 years tuning all those gut strings. The many depictions of instruments being tuned do more than just demonstrate a practical reality, however. The metaphor we looked at earlier sheds some light on the meaning behind the act of tuning, which symbolized the restoring of harmony to a state of disorder. This harmony was fragile, as strings would go out of tune or break all the time. Enjoying a good sound took constant care, But from this metaphorical angle, where strings represented spirit, after all, tuning became something almost ceremonial, something to do consciously instead of just trying to get it over with. Today, German vernacular calls someone in bad spirits verstimmt, out of tune, while the term for a good mood is gute Stimmung, a good tuning. No technological limitation would have prevented musicians back then from simply putting 6 thick metal strings on a heavy wooden box for twice the volume at half the inconvenience. Yet nobody did until the 1800s rolled around. To people of the previous centuries, the sound of double strings seems to have been worth all the trouble, and some of the limitations that did exist were worked around, one being that a thick gut string sounds like this. Swiss music theorist Sebastian Wirdung already describes this problem and its solution in 1511. He calls the 3 thickest strings Brummer, which translates to buzzer or mumbler, and states that you can't hear them as well at a distance compared to the thinner strings. And that's why you pair them with a string up an octave to balance bass and treble. Marco dell'Aquila's piece without a top string benefits from that principle, as the mixture of thick and thin provides a sound you just wouldn't get out of 5 strings as opposed to 10. I figured that part of the lesson here is to always be prepared to make the most out of an unfortunate situation. So just in case I ever have a really bad day, I wrote this. We have already reached the end of this episode, but I reserved the time to speak on some personal matters, so well, you'll notice that there are many more ams and ahs because, you know, I'm not reading off a script. So yeah, this episode was actually surprisingly difficult to make. Well, I kind of described this difficulty in the very beginning of the video. It's very easy for a video about strings to become very dry and very boring, and I think I spent more time actually deciding what parts already to cut out again than actually writing. So, well, finally now it's done, and I hope that you enjoyed it, and it wasn't too much like sitting in school or something. Anyway, so the most important part of this final section of the video is my moment to express my gratitude towards all the people who make this project, Memo, possible, which is you, the viewers, well, all of you, everyone who's watching, and especially those of you who already signed up on patreon.com to support this project, Memo, with your donations. Just as a small sort of explanation how it works, it's basically a service where you can offer a small amount. The sort of rule of thumb is more or less what a cup of coffee costs in your home country, so maybe $2 or more, it really depends. And this amount is then donated to me whenever I release a new episode of Memo. And since last episode, which was released around Christmas time, another, I think, 10 or even more patrons, joined this whole endeavor, and well, this is already quite amazing. What's even more amazing is that now the number of countries where support is coming from rose to 20, which is pretty incredible. Well, you can see all the colorful little flags next to the names, and that it reaches somehow really some people on the whole planet, and faraway countries. Yeah, I mean, it's just a very special feeling. Anyway, just yeah, know that you have my deep gratitude, not only for the support itself, but just the gesture alone of supporting something like this. It really means something. Furthermore, I would like to thank Memo's first sponsor for their special support. It's the online string service Cuerdas Pulsadas. You can see the website here on the left, and well, it fits the theme of this episode pretty well. It's a website where you can find a huge assortment of strings. I mean, not only lute strings or gut strings, but strings for all kinds of instruments. I don't think they have cat strings made out of cats, but yeah, those shouldn't exist anyway. They also offer special timed discounts, which well, invites to have a look there from time to time. You can find the link to the website down there. If you'd like to find out more about this program, Memo, and are perhaps even considering becoming a patron, you can find all information on Memo's own website, which you can see here, and the address is musicamemo.com. And regardless of whether you are a patron or not, you can not only find all previous episodes there, but also a way to subscribe to Memo's newsletter, which will inform you by email whenever a new video is released. So what remains to be said is that I hope you enjoyed this episode, and that you'll be joining me for the upcoming installment of Memo.